Hey, thanks for joining me again. Today I want to talk about royal icing. It's kind of a misunderstood medium, but really, to me, it's kind of a fabulous medium. There's so many different things that it can do. Everything from really delicate string work, nice elegant borders, brush embroidery, multiple layered beautiful borders, to piped collars, thin it down and it turns into color flow, and that is really great as a collar for a cake, or as independent like puffed lettering, and even on cookies it looks really great. So today I'm going to talk about some recipes that you want to use, the way you want to bring it to the right consistency, and how to adapt to different kind of weather environments that may affect it, and then also how to store it and how to use it after that point. So let's get started on some recipes. Okay, so there's basically three different types of recipes for royal icing that you can use. Classically, you would use an egg white, and you can do that if you crack the egg with just the white and leave it in the refrigerator overnight to kind of relax a little bit. That's going to make a better royal icing. However, let me suggest it's not so safe. These eggs are not pasteurized. They're just really not terribly safe to work with when you're putting it on cake and you're going to be actually eating it. What I would suggest instead is some of the other two varieties of recipes. One is this royal icing mix that we have from CK, and it is just add water. Now the recipe says to add 5 tablespoons, and let me suggest that maybe you start with 4 and decide if you want to add that 5th. And that's really going to depend on the humidity of where you are. For instance, yesterday I made one recipe. Today I made it again. Yesterday it was very dry and hot outside. Today it's rainy, and they reacted 2 different complete ways. So be a little bit flexible with your recipe. Be prepared to either add a little bit more water, just drop at a time, or add a tablespoon or 2 of powdered sugar just to stiffen it up. The other recipe I like to work with is kind of a go-to for me. I have a little bit more control over it. So what I do is I start with 2 pounds of powdered sugar and I weigh it. I don't just trust the bag that it says 2 pounds. I always weigh my ingredients, and I sift that first. Just put it in the bowl of a stand mixer, and then I'm going to use 1 ounce of meringue powder. Again, I weigh that just to make sure, and I add between 4 and 5 ounces of water, and then 2 tablespoons of glucose. And the glucose I really like to use whether I'm doing the royal icing out of the bag, like the instant mix, just add water, or if I'm making it with meringue powder. Now what the glucose does is it adds a little bit of stretchiness without changing the consistency. Like if you add corn syrup, it's thin, it's almost pourable like water. So the glucose is like the same consistency that the royal icing should be, and it doesn't change it. It just adds a little bit of stretchiness so that when you do string work, things like that, it's not going to break. Now, important no matter which recipe that you use, make it the night before you use it. Okay, I'm going to show you an example. We're going to talk about some of these little detailed things later, but if you get a close-up of this collar work that I did, you can really see here where there's some air bubbles. This one I poured right after I mixed the icing. Now if you look, I'll have the exact same thing. I saved this and just let it rest overnight. This is just a color flow icing. I would normally trap it with a border, but I'm just going to pour out a little drop here, and you can see that there's not going to be any air bubbles in it. And that is the reason that you want to let it rest overnight. And how you do that, to let it rest overnight, you're not just going to cover it. What you want to do is get a damp paper towel, just like this, and you're going to put it right down on the surface of the icing, and then wrap this whole bowl in plastic wrap. And that's how you always want to store royal icing. If you don't, it's going to dry out really, really quickly. You might see royal icing on gingerbread houses. It's nice and firm, but still pristine and white. So that's how you want to control it. Keep a little bit of moisture right on the surface. Wrap the whole thing to keep the air out. Now if you need to go somewhere, you're traveling with the royal icing and you need to carry the bag, what I like to do is make sure it's sealed from both ends. So here I have like a rubber stopper to keep this end nice and closed off. And then for this end, what I want to do is this is another damp paper towel. I'm just going to wrap it around there nice and tight and stick this whole thing inside a baggie. And then that royal icing is going to be ready to pipe. Get as much air out of it as you can. And that's going to be ready to pipe and nice and contained so that it's not going to dry out on you. Going back to talking about consistency, it really is important that you have the proper thickness for the application that you're using. For instance, if you get a close-up here of this piping that I did earlier, this was a batch that I did, again, when it was kind of raining outside and the water was a little bit too much for it. It was just a little bit too soft. So you can tell it looks kind of flat and it's sinking into itself, especially here, like on the, where I used the larger star tip, that definition disappears. And this is that same batch, and I'll just pipe a quick straight line here for you. And it's just not as as distinct. Here I've got a batch that's a little bit firmer, and although it's going to be a little bit more difficult for you to pipe, I really want you to kind of go ahead and take the trouble, if it's piping out flat like this, go ahead and take it out of your bag and thicken it up a little bit. You're just never going to get the result that you want from a flat royal icing. It really needs to be stiff enough, and it probably will just take an extra tablespoon or two of powdered sugar to get it thickened up the way you need it, so it gives you the result that you need. While I'm actually piping with different tips and different bags, what I like to do is keep it in this tip bag stand. It is a PME bag stand, and this sponge stays wet. If it ever goes dry on you, it's not keeping your tips nice and moist. So as long as your bags are closed from this end and then they're touching that damp end, you're good to go. You can just kind of keep them out with you all day. One other application I really like is if you take the cake boards and the color flow icing, and again, the color flow icing is just a thinned royal icing, just kind of thinned enough like the consistency of honey, where it will keep its consistency enough that it flows, but it will kind of drizzle like honey. Like, see how it keeps its shape there for just a couple of seconds and then falls out? That's the consistency of color flow that you want. But this application that I really like, and I would use more color flow icing than this, just to cover your entire cake board with color flow icing and let it completely dry. And especially if you can put it under a desk lamp, it really brings a nice shine to your work. This is a really, really elegant way to also decorate your cake board rather than just having like a plain wrapped drum. This is nice, but to take it a step further, you can cover it with the color flow icing that's going to look really, really great. So those are a few tips on making the royal icing. You shouldn't use it on buttercream ever. You kind of want to keep your royal icing away from anything that has anything that's fat based. So don't use it in a plastic bowl that may have retained some fat in it. Don't pipe it on buttercream. That's a no-no. The royal icing should either be piped on its own or piped onto fondant. And just keep it kind of away from the dry air. Keep it covered with a little bit of moisture, and then you're going to be able to use it a little bit longer. And again, don't forget, make it the night before so all those air bubbles can fall out of the work you're going to use. We're going to make a lot of videos on these different types of projects: the brushed embroidery, the string work, the collars, the piped butterflies and letters, all kinds of things you can do with royal icing. So I hope you'll be on the lookout for those, and I appreciate you watching today.